Bonjour. The theme of this roundtable is actually, I think it's a good continuation of the previous discussion. It's between the arts, actually, it's between people. We have here 7 presenters. I have asked to them to talk about interdisciplinarity, multiculturalism, cultural integration, community integration, social integration. It's really large theme, but we don't want to discuss it like philosophically or theoretically or by intention. We want concrete examples of what they do and why they do it and what are the results. It was not supposed to be a discussion, but if we have time, we will do it. It's a kind of pitch, 5 minutes each one. So I will present you. Thørbjørn doesn't want to begin. No, okay, you will not. Okay, here is David Dacks from Music Gallery, Toronto. Thørbjørn from New York, and she's also artistic director of the Pan-Asia Sounding Festival. Elke Moltrecht. Okay, sorry. Académie des Arts du Monde, Academy of the World Arts.
Arts of the World.
Arts of the World, okay. Thørbjørn Thonder Hansen, artistic director of the festival Ultima in Oslo. Also Tom Welsh, artistic director of the music series at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I'm sorry. Also Peter Burton, he will maybe arrive. He's from Salone Popolo. And
well, it's downstairs. He said he was not coming. He doesn't remember that he should be up top.
If you see, si tu vois François Paris aussi, they are waiting the audiences. Yeah. And François Paris is François Paris. Yes, it is Festival Manca at Nice. Is the artistic director. Sorry. Okay, now we can begin for the two of you. Do you want to come, David, to begin? No? Tom?
Yeah, I'm on the end. I'm happy to start. Thank you. Yes, I'm the director of performing arts at the Cleveland Museum of Art, Cleveland, Ohio. Sound familiar to anybody? I hope. Yeah. Very short, Tracy, on that. The Cleveland Museum, if you haven't been, please come visit us. It's one of America's great collections. Depending on who you're arguing with, it's the best or maybe second best collection of objects, wide-ranging, the history of human endeavor across all fields, 17 curators. It's the only one of the American museums of that stature that has always had a music curator as well. So for 100 years, the Cleveland Museum has been doing concerts. Currently, I'm sitting in that chair. That's interesting because the forefathers at the time had I think the vision to say that music and performance sits here on equal status and equal footing with the visual arts. So the museum is well known, I would say, as a great collection of visual work world over, less well known for performance, but we're working hard to change that as we have really kind of brightened up the community, I think, in our year-round concert programming. Concrete examples of that. In every way, our performing arts series I think needs to resemble the collection itself. It's a huge range of human activity, old and new, every corner of the earth, old ideas, new ideas, all welcome. And on a personal level, of course, I take the whole series and sort of pitch the whole thing. It leans forward, so it's much more in the present, perhaps, than it used to be with my predecessors. This year is an exciting year for us because after 100 years of great activity and nearly everybody that we could think of has come through the Cleveland Museum, going all the way back to Ravel, Bartok, Respighi, and on and on. We're commissioning a handful of 6 composers, and for the first time. It's not an institution that's had a commissioning history, but we're suddenly taking a great leap forward. It's kind of a pilot project where we've identified 6 composers in one way to stand aside of the traditional commissioning system, whereas I'd hand Thørbjørn a pile of cash and he'd hand me a string quartet, and then that's that. But instead, what we're going to do is have these composers come visit us at the Cleveland, come stay with us at the Cleveland Museum for some period of time, take a deep dive into the collections themselves, meet the entire curatorial staff, look for some energy or some ideas or some inspirations that spark, and maybe I was just thinking about this, putting together old conversations that somewhere got separated, maybe in the 1950s and 60s. Visual artists, musical performers, musicians should really be back to speaking to each other again, not to mention dancers and all the other formats. So these composers will stay with us for a little while and indulge themselves in the great collections that we have in Cleveland, perhaps find something that turns them on to a new idea, a new direction, and they'll go away and create that work in constant contact with us and any of the resources we have to offer to them through a museum, and then have a world premiere that's scheduled sometime out in the future. Intentionally, we've chosen 6 composers who are really from the farthest corners of the world for all the reasons that we know. I mean, the stage, if you're in Cleveland and you're listening to all the classical music that's on offer, you're hearing like this little slice of human activity, but we all know that it's really like all of this. So let's have more voices and more ideas and more people with very different experiences coming to our community to share that with us. So stay tuned, and a year from now I'll come back and tell you if we've had success or what's come of it. But yeah, that's my story.
Good, thank you.
One of my stories.
Thank you. So Thørbjørn, you have a story to tell us?
Yeah, what kind of story do you want? Yeah, so I am Thørbjørn, and I am the artistic director of the Ultima Festival in Oslo, a new one to that position. I started officially the 1st of October last year, and while I was finishing my previous job in Copenhagen in Denmark, I'm Danish, and therefore everything in a way is new. The festival is in September every year, 10 days, and it is structured in a very Norwegian way. In 1990, 17 institutions in Oslo got together and said to each other, okay, if we're going to do a festival here, we need to do it together. So each of these institutions contributed with a concert that they paid for themselves. So 1 to 17, we had a festival. And that's nearly 30 years ago, and then the festival has developed, of course, a lot since then, and been through many phases, I would say, of directors, of course, on the one hand, and development on the other, financial situations, and aesthetics. So I come in at a time, I think, in a good time, where the festival is really running well, and there's lots of public attention during the festival in Oslo, and also the way it's been developing the last, I'd say, 10 years is for me very positive, because it's been developing interdisciplinary, you could say, aesthetically, and also in an outreach dimension, really doing projects not only in the concert halls, but also in the city, in various open spaces, creating new cultural context for the work. So in that way, it's kind of a challenge to come and say, okay, now I will make things even better or even differently. So I think for today, I mean, I think Lou Reed in an interview when he did this project with the side cuts in Berlin, where metal machine music was played, he was on stage being interviewed by this very academic German journalist, and the German journalist asked him 7 questions at once, and he said, all right, I'm an old man, I'll answer the first 2. And what I meant with that, I can't in 5 minutes, answer multiculturalism, integration, interdisciplinarity, and so on. So what I wanted to do was just to reflect a little bit on how we can make the contemporary music world go forward. And I think musically speaking, at least in Scandinavia, there's one success story that we like to tell over the last 10 years, that we have managed to open up musically. The genres are now not really there anymore. We have managed to keep a contemporary music viewpoint on things while opening up towards jazz or towards electronic music or towards various versions of experimental music, and we have sort of managed that, and we are very happy about that. And to some extent, it's true. But I think there's much more to be done, and the next step in Scandinavia, I think, is the, what should we call it, diversity or multiculturalism aspects of really opening up. As also was said before, one thing is reaching out, but I think maybe we should just embrace that language and say, okay, we need to work together in a completely different way. So, in terms of opening the aesthetics of a festival, the festival has kind of managed over the years to open up musically, but I think the next step is to also open up, what should we call it, culturally or politically. In Europe, I think there is a sort of new, interesting beginning in terms of contemporary music, where first it's a kind of language of defeat. You could say that, okay, we are very isolated and our music is very difficult, and since the Second World War, the kind of answer to the Second World War in Europe was to make pure and ideologically music which was very much removed from society, so we didn't have to even think about it. But now, I think young people, composers, presenters are really wanting to work in a more political way with contemporary music. So first it is, okay, we are sort of 10, 15, 20 years behind theater and visual arts, so they have been doing it for years, and now finally we are getting the point and starting to do it. But getting beyond that kind of language, and then saying, okay, so how do we do it? And I think in Scandinavia and also in Norway, it's of course on the one hand a dramatically unique, homogenic society. At least we'd like to think so, but it's not, of course. We have lots of immigrants there that we need to reach out to in our contemporary music world. So how do we do that? And I think that we have to do away with our kind of feeling of being a privileged art form. Like the French sociologist Pierrette, he had this term he called social distinction, that some people think that they are socially distinct, so their taste is the privileged one and it's the true one. And I think contemporary music has very much been about having that kind of self-understanding that we are the privileged ones, we kind of come out of the highest rank of music, so our pure taste is the right taste, and the others just need to understand that. And this also goes, I think, when it comes to the cultural and political aspects of music, that we need to, make our music more open, eclectic. Some people of the critics will say that will make it dirty, and I think, yeah, okay, then let's present some dirty music, if that's what we need to do. So, breaking down the social distinction of our hierarchies and really reaching out to creating a more equal level is one vision that I think slowly, I'm not the only one, we are lots of people in festival networks and presenters talking about that, and also in Scandinavia there is an initiative by the Nordic Ministry of Culture, which is the 5 Nordic countries all together, where they have made a 3-year program on how do we create more diversity in the arts, and I'm very happy to contribute to that with the festival. Should I stop there, maybe? Yeah, very good.
I forgot to mention Elke is from Cologne.
Yeah, I have the fantastic gift in my hand. I'm one of the directors of a totally international, but in German located institution. So we have under our top cultures from outside of Europe and from Europe. So we give each day, daily, really in our regular life, working life, we give voice to Western and non-Western artists and people. And our artistic director, for instance, is an Indian filmmaker, and our members are from all over the world, and the fellowship is also quite international. And the result of these fantastic basic facts, we started some years ago. We are just 5 years old, and I'm there since 4 years. we started to rethink nearly everything. How to commission works, how to think about funding situation, how to make the arts political relevant and not in these, not in pattern, really to ask post-colonial questions, global questions, cosmopolitan questions, and found out that the artists are quite open and interesting to follow us with our questions. And right, Thørbjørn, the music is really behind, the contemporary music is really behind, and I wouldn't agree to make it a bit more rich by also opening it to maybe other art forms. I think it's also quite necessary to open the contemporary music really to political aspects. And how do we try to do so? For instance, not just in music, but also in other art forms. So we related our open call not just to make us a string quartet or a film or so, we related it to our mission of the Academy. It's just a half-page long text, what includes all these questions we would like to ask around and give backgrounds of connections between agriculture in Africa and Europe, and weapon industry and Europe and US, and also in the history, botanical gardens and colonialism, or we looked for sources of colonialism in Cologne, and of course it was not nice for the politicians. They didn't like that we asked colonial questions to the city itself, when Adenauer, for instance, said, so we need more land, and he meant, of course, the colonies. So the open call went really well with artists who reacted to this mission of the Academy, and so each year we chose about 7 to 10 projects that well received our mission. Or we do projects, for instance, between Kinshasa now and Cologne and Berlin, and we ask for the position of the Kinshasa people. The content is the fashion industry that started with the second-hand clothes we sent tens of years to Africa, but the Africans started to recreate fantastic fashion from it. Of course, it is also connected to the fake fashion industry, making something pseudo Gucci, etc. And now we have a school in Berlin, a design school in Berlin, and one in Kinshasa, and it's some exchange of some students and professors, and we will really show the perspective of the Kinshasa students. On the one hand, they create a fashion collection, and from Berlin as well, and we do photo shooting, really like a choreographed photo shooting, and in Cologne we do a kind of tableau vivant. We show these photos. The whole working process in Kinshasa and in Berlin is documented by Skype and by handy photos and recordings. And this will become a kind of film, and there will be speeches, and there will be this fashion show, of course. And so we asked these positions and we presented. And botanical garden as a third question. So it is fantastic really to go deep in these history from the 19th century, when the zoos and the botanical gardens were found, how the way from the plants came from. And it is the same Provenienzforschung. Provenienz, I don't know what it means. So where does a flower come from? So it is the same way in the artwork in museums. Where does the art come from? Also, or the ethnological museums. And it is quite opening background with asking those questions, and I have a really big hope, maybe starting with an international conference, to bring these topics, the political relevance of maybe thematic related commissions also to contemporary music, and would be really interested to share it with colleagues how to come closer to it also for the contemporary music.
Good, thank you. Do you? Fourth one?
I firstly I just would like to start by saying that my place is actually coming from an active composer and a performer. And I think that dictates and shape how I view as the world, and as what needed to be addressed as festivals, as a society, what needs to be done. So having said that, I'm just happen to be a woman, happen to be a people of color, and I happen to do many different artistic practices in my own work. So the driven part is that I realize that I'm often viewed as an outcast. Like, oh, she's crazy, so she get to do whatever she wants to do. So I thought, I'm going to make up all this platform for as many crazy people as me can share that platform. So what that is the inclusiveness, right? The inclusive. If I have more people, more women, more people, color, whatever that means, and actually sometimes you have to fight the fight, and it gets emotional. But I think it's worth the fight. And sometimes I also ask those questions to myself and to the programming too. Is who owns the culture and who should be the culture ambassador, and what is culture itself? As an artist ourselves, we can say that we have our own personal taste. But I think as an artist director, as a curator, it's almost a sin to neglect what is the bigger culture, what is the bigger dialogue need to be having and need to be had. So with that in mind, when I see things that I wanted to address, for instance, why there need to be more different practices, but I do need to start from somewhere, right? So that this new festival I'm trying to initiate is about deep collaborations, about cross-regional stuff, but it's not only about Asian people. It is also about the question of because inside Asian countries, and Asia is such a big continent, including Central Asia, we often forget that there is that part too, and is that the where was I? Sorry. Thank you.
It's my fault. I said to do you. I want you to say what you said in 30 minutes earlier. I want you to say it in 5 minutes. So.
Yeah, it's the worst thing to say to a performer. Like repeat exactly the same thing, but done in 5 minutes. But I think it's about questioning of within the country region itself that it's every society can be very homogenic. That we had this talk in Norway, in China, it's very homogenic. In countries like in Cambodia, so nations, regions like that. So I wanted to collaborate with groups that is funded there, having the musicians from there, but having the access to the top-notch practice mode. And then let's experiment, because there is no success, but there is accomplishment, if that makes sense. So it's not about tourist culture. It's not about World Expo. It's not about. It is about individual narrative stories, and I think that should be talked more about.
Thank you. David Dacks from Music Gallery, Toronto.
Hi there. I'm guessing that many of you know the Music Gallery in Toronto. It's an old school institution, over 40 years old at this point, Toronto Centre of Creative Music. I usually don't use the term new music. Creative music I find is a much more inclusive and forgiving term in many ways, but it also has a specific history to it, going back to Chicago in the mid-'60s with the Association for Advancement of Creative Musicians. And when thinking about the many, many categories that are in this question, multi-arts and multiculturalism sort of can come together in my mind. I think of my daughter and her friends and the generation that is starting to grace the stages at our institution, and Multi-arts is just kind of a fact of life. I mean, most of the time, if you're listening to music, it's near a screen of some kind. You're getting some kind of visual content with musical enjoyment. Many of you have facilities that you work into that you want to use to their best advantage through site-specific activities or by programming things in a certain way that you know that the room itself will respond to and the people who fill it will respond accordingly. So multi-arts is something that's kind of inevitable in trying to choose and make the best presentation choices that will get the idea of the show across. And that is also, I guess on a more cynical level, is encouraged in Canada by funding organizations that want to see presenting organizations get together and do bigger things. So that often involves multi-arts constructions. And then it becomes a question of negotiating the power relationships in those. And in Toronto, Toronto is 51% composed of visible minorities. So with a heavily funded heavily publicly funded institution like the Music Gallery, it kind of behooves us just to take a look around and see what's going on and to address both the challenges of negotiating multi-arts and multicultural issues with the institutional privilege that is inherent in what we do. So there's always talk of power, there's always talk of how culture plays a role and how the art looks coming out of it. I guess I'll talk about one specific example that I thought was a really good outcome a couple of years ago. 2015, we worked with pianist David Varelis, who is based in New York. He used to be based in Toronto. He's well known for working with Henry Threadgill and his bands, and has put out a number of really exciting records on the ECM label. So he grew up in Toronto. He actually came from Cuba to Toronto, which itself is a testament to Canada, because you can't come from Cuba to the U.S. and go into higher education right away. There's the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba does not make that possible. However, the relationship between Canada and Cuba does make that possible, that he had a top-notch musical education in Canada and got adopted into a scene of fellow Cuban expats in Toronto that were able to allow him the space to develop his artistry the way that he wanted before going back to New York. So he came back to Toronto, we met, and he said he wanted to do a combination of the music of the Cuban anti-colonial Abacua Brotherhood combined with orchestral elements. This is something he couldn't pull off in New York. He didn't have the community surrounding him. He doesn't have the resources to assemble a chamber ensemble, and nobody really understood the project in the US. Certainly a Cuban-American collaboration was a little bit more fraught than a Cuban-Canadian one. So first of all, the beauty of this collaboration was it was his idea to start with, and the question became how to execute what he wanted with the resources that we had, or if we didn't have those resources, how could we get them and put them into this project to his satisfaction. So we partnered with two other organizations. One was Lula Lounge in Toronto, which is a really unique cultural institution in our city. It's one of the few venues which is owned and operated by artists of color. Usually, even if you do have space to do things, the building itself is not owned by artists, and even less often is it owned by artists of color. So Lula has been an incredible success story in spreading Latin arts and culture, a third language of Spanish, other than English and French, very difficult to establish in Toronto or anywhere in Canada outside of the funding dyad that often goes down to those two things. They've done great work in building community. And also Array Music, which is a very similar institution to the Music Gallery, except that it contains an ensemble that goes back about 45 years. So Varelis cut his teeth at Lula as a teen, moved to New York, and the first people that I wanted to connect with was his family back in Toronto at Lula, because I knew that we'd be able to get percussionists and other players through there who understood culturally deeply where he was coming from this project. And we managed to get some really top-notch drummers in Toronto, also under the tutelage of a master drummer that he brought with him, Roman Diaz from New York. And it was an amazing partnership between someone who's an acknowledged drum elder in the Cuban diaspora, and also connecting with our local scene, which is quite thriving itself. In fact, the ensemble included a father and son, so that was a nice thing to see. Array music was also very sensitive to his needs, helped him to work out some of the problems in the orchestration for the specific instrumentation that he had. He had a wide musical knowledge, but there were certain things he wasn't able to do, and the openness of the musician and the leader, the contractor of the Array ensemble, helped get things exactly where he wanted them to be. So with these two organizations on board, we produced something that was much bigger than the sum of its parts. It was almost a $50,000 production. It was a way to kickstart this idea that he had no way to develop in New York otherwise. And it came from multiple sources of funding. It came from operating funding. It came from project grants. And it turned into a recording. He didn't record the versions that he did at the music gallery, but it became a recording that was released on ECM last fall, in fact, and distributed worldwide. So it had a lasting public documentation and impact for that. So with the creative promotion from all three of these parties, it reached a very different hybrid audience in Toronto, each of which plugged into different things. I will say one audience that it didn't reach in Toronto, I'm thinking about what Gabrielle said before about Anglo privilege, is that since this was an anti-colonial statement done entirely in Spanish, a lot of the people for whom anti-colonial and decolonization politics were a hot topic of conversation in Toronto were not engaged because of the language factor. These conversations tend to happen in English a lot in Toronto, and to have somebody presenting an artwork in Spanish that dealt with these issues did not resonate with people who I thought it might. But that's something to build on, and yet a very tangible lesson to learn from an experience like that. So in terms of nuts and bolts of building projects, definitely one of the most important things is to have the artist concept first, and seeing how we as institutions can serve that and help to negotiate the power structures to make that happen.
Oh, thank you, David. Peter Burton, Salone Popolo, Montréal.
Hi, everyone. Nice to get a chance to talk to you all. The Salone Popolo is, as Pierrette said, is a festival based in Montreal. Our festival takes place in June, so I'll shortly be going back to work and getting ready for that. This year we'll be putting on about 85 events over a 20-day or so period. And then throughout the rest of the year, we'll probably do another 60 concerts or so around the full calendar. So we put on all these events. We have a small team. So our relationships with other presenters, the importance of developing bridges with other communities and audiences is really important, because we have so many projects that we need to organize, so we need a lot of partners to work with. And this approach is pretty fundamental to how we do everything. So it's really built into our system from the very beginning of anything we do. So this is not some kind of addition to our festival programming, but it's involved really a radical rethink about how a festival operates and what its values are, because all our work with different communities has forced us to really sort of reevaluate who we are and how we do things. A fundamental approach that we always try to adopt is to work with each project as an individual project and really think about what the requirements are for different partners and what they want from us. So for example, if we're working with a string quartet, they may just need a rehearsal space. But if we're working with transgender youth, then their requirements are radically different. They may actually just be looking for a safe space where they don't feel threatened. So you really have to understand what people need in order to work together with them. Extreme flexibility is at the basis of all our partnerships. And depending on who you work with, people are going to ask for a stake in your organization, I find, and that's something really important to think about, because if you're dealing with people from marginalized communities, then it's very important for them to be part of the power structure and to be brought in and to be given a real decision-making powers. So that means we've had to change our board structure, our programming structure, and open that up to people other than who originally were doing that work in our festival. And I think that it also means that we've had to rethink the difference between genres, as Thørbjørn was saying, because you can't put one genre over another genre and tell people that, you know, this genre is more important than that genre. So it's a really important thing to be able to do to flatten things out and establish things as part of a continuum from new music, jazz, onto popular music forms, younger artists, older artists, and so on. And the rewards are really intense and great because you can put on a lot of activities, you can bring in a lot of different audience types, and you can really feel as though you're doing something relevant and contemporary.
Thank you, Peter. François Paris, du Festival Manca.
Hello, I'm the director of the CIRM. The CIRM is one of the 7th National Center of Musical Creation in France. It's a special label from the Minister of Culture. And how can I resume what we do? We have 4 main missions. The first one is the diffusion. We have the Festival Manca, for instance, which is a festival with contemporary music, but not only contemporary music. We try to use multi-arts and multidisciplinarity programs. We do transmission, pedagogical program. We are linked with the University of Nice. And we do also research. And the question is how to put all these missions together. And especially for an artistic project. I just want to give you just one example. Is an example of the barrier of the language between all the different artistic disciplines. For instance, we could say that we are going to organize a new project with a choreographer and a composer. But the fact is that the composer is not talking the same language as the choreographer. So the question is how to make the communication easier between these disciplines. You have the same problem with a stage director, for instance, and everybody knows that a stage director for an opera is unable to, he is not able to read the scores in general. It's very rare to find a stage director who is able to read a score. And this has a lot of very pragmatical consequences. For instance, if you made a creation, a premiere, if the stage director is not able to hear the score, he has no idea about how much time he needs to change the stage, because he don't know, he is unable to read the score. So we have linked the research with the production, and we have developed a tool which is able to produce a simulation of the music which is going to come. We play the music before the musicians. And it means that the stage director, for instance, or the choreographer, will be able to hear what is going to happen with the music. So it means that he can build a kind of, he will be able to know exactly how much time he has to change the stage, for instance, between 2 scenes, and so on and so on. But it's not only the pragmatical arguments for that. I can give you my own experience with a choreographer. We have worked together and we had a piece and we have a special moment, and with a big, very, very clear pulsation, with a very clear beat. And she was telling me, no, I don't feel the beat, I don't understand, I don't feel that. So okay, I go in my room and I rewrite this passage. And 2 days after, she said, no, it doesn't work. And suddenly, a sound engineer told me, let's try something, because I think you don't use low instruments enough. So you don't excite the sub loudspeaker. And if you just change the one instrument, one percussion instrument, maybe let's try that. And I've taken exactly the same score, and I've just changed one percussion instrument, and suddenly the sub have begun to be exciting. And she said, the choreographer said, okay, that's exactly what I've done. And I give you this example because sometimes you can lose a lot of time just to communicate, just to have the good arguments to change, to arrange what you are doing. This is a part of my job. And this is the reason why we try to link all the time the diffusion, the production, and the research. And when you have done that, it's very simple to imagine that you can make the transmission about that. You can make some, you have students, you can build some student exchange, you have some students for the technological point of view, you have students for the musicological point of view, and so on and so on. And that's what we do in this.
Thank you, François. I think this idea of dialogue, of language, is very important. Take time. It's always take time to have an encounter, a real one. And as you said about the choreographer, last week in Le Vivier, Anna Sokolovic talked about she's a specialist to work with dancers, and she worked with a choreographer. He said, and she said, the important thing is to be stable, stable rhythm. Okay, she said, okay, I will do it, but please hear my music and you will see me, you will say to me which music you prefer, okay? And she heard a lot of music and finally she said, I really like this one. It was absolutely not stable rhythmically, absolutely not, it was the worst. And she realized at this moment, for the choreographer, the sense of the rhythm was absolutely not the same of a composer. So it's kind of, when we do partnership as an organizer, we know that. We have to learn the meaning of the others, their capacity, their needing, and etc. So, I think we have some minutes for, if you have some question for anyone on the panel, please. Oh, it's time to take alcohol. Okay, thank you. Oh, you have?
I wanted to come back to the description of the working process. That means the choreographer and the musician or group is they are working not together. And we had this morning, they do it after each other. We had this morning this example by Heiner Goebbels, who exactly described how it is when a group of people is working together and how much bigger the result will be when the dialogue was there from the beginning. And I have the same experiences in my work at the academy, but also I'm directing an ensemble together with Sandra Bhagwati with musicians from different cultures, and it is more a dialogue project at the beginning, and after a long dialogue, understanding not just the language, understanding also the difference of cultures, and the difference of intonations, and the difference of whatever, rhythms and pulse and so on. And I think to come deeper in these interdisciplinary, or also in these understanding the changes of the society we have everywhere in Canada, it is the same way like in Germany or in Europe. It means to find new ways of dialogue to come closer, to create then a different quality of projects together that can include different genres, disciplines, but it can include also facts of the different cultures and as I said again already, the global and big things we have to touch with all these new quality of dialogue, I would say.
Can I just add? Actually, I was on the same panel with Heiner Goebbels 3 weeks ago about opera, a new opera stage. Because here is like music festivals that we actually have a little bit of freedom to have different venues, to have a different programming go into different venues. Now, what happens is that places like in New York or Philadelphia, so if you have a big opera house that you have to fill 1,000 people audience, and how do you just do not have that freedom. And then in different disciplines, that I think that it's one thing to have a cross discipline. It's actually also a kind of false to have a true understanding of what people are talking about is the common language. Because in theater, on Broadway or off Broadway, for instance, the hierarchy is completely different. Composer come later, right? So you have the director, you have the book. Book is book, and then composer, and then a lyricist, and then you have a preview weeks that you can still do like this. So what happens is that musicians get booked that they don't want to be there because they are not trained to be sitting around and wait. You're wasting those musicians' time. And then so the stage director is completely adding that to the different culture. You have a disaster bound to happen. So that maybe is something that is how to have an understanding and a training program for the new generations, the artists who can have that kind of different skill sets and can talk those languages in a very deep, fundamental way.
Ta-da! Thank you. Philippe, you have a question.
No, it's not a question.
You have
It's
a
an affirmation.
I just want to share what experience we like to do. I'm running the same kind of structure that François, and we are making a small mini festival of interdisciplinary improvisation. What we do is we are 3 or 4 producers. We choose artists. We look at that artists never work together, and we say we are going to make trio with always musicians, visual artists, choreographers, dancers, whatever. And then they arrive the day before. In the morning they met, they work all the day, and at the end of the day we open to the audience.
Oh, wow.
And this is absolutely incredible, because last time we did that, we have this experience that you have 3 people who never work together, and you see a show, it's like they spend 3 months in residencies together, you know? And it's very interesting how they manage to be together. Some work in the morning at 8, they start to work, and others, they just take a coffee until 4, and then they start 4:30 slowly. So this is, this kind of improvisation and making people met from different disciplinaries, it's really, really rich. It's fantastic.
You do this, Peter. Put people together, they have not worked together before, and
Yeah, sure. That's part of improvised music. So good improvisers are used to, it's the only music form where people can meet each other and go on stage and perform a credible concert. And that's what makes the practice so interesting. And a good model for arts presenters and for life in general.
for life, yes, also. Thank you all.